Great. Thanks, Mark. And let me join Mark in his earlier comments to welcome all of you here today, but then also emphasize how excited we are to have your engagement in all of what we're doing, and also to roll out our strategic plan that we've really spent a lot of time developing. So within the area of the biomedical innovation, just to provide some broader policy environment, patient access to promising new therapies and devices is challenged by a lot of the same sort of political and economic pressures that we're seeing the need for reforms on how care is delivered. It takes way too long to develop a drug, to get a drug to market, 10 plus years to get a drug. And that's really challenging for really early promising innovation that, you find something that really might help patients, and to have patients have to wait so long. I mean, it's important to develop the right kind of evidence on benefits and risks, but we need to make that process much more efficient. It costs too much to develop drugs, maybe $2.6 billion, if you believe Tufts, but maybe the number is close. It's certainly over $1 billion. That's really expensive to develop a drug, and it suggests that there's a lot of inefficiencies and waste in the way that we've designed our system and the way that we're collecting the evidence. We're also spending a lot on drugs. If we look at some of the cost trends over the last couple of years, a lot of spending on pharmaceutical products. We have a very strong pipeline of drugs that are specialty drugs that are really high cost, potentially curative, and specialty drugs are about a third of our overall drug spending in the United States, and that's expected to increase as well. And the challenge that we have is that our current system for how we pay for drugs and how we incentivize the use of drugs isn't really aligned with making sure that patients are getting the best outcomes that they need. At the same time, policymakers, especially policymakers in Washington, D.C., are struggling with, how do we incentivize innovation and make sure, because we still have a lot of unmet need. A lot of diseases don't have appropriate therapies or cures. How do we incentivize innovation in those areas, but also make sure that the innovation is affordable and have policies that promote value and quality rather than limit access? And so needed are ways to incentivize the investment in novel areas to help treat patients, really innovative ways to reduce the time and cost of drug development, and also ways to support higher value use of these products, drugs, devices, et cetera. And a big part of that is continuing to learn about the benefits, safety, and value of these products from pre-market to post-market. And so that sort of sets up for this portfolio of work and how it supports the center's mission, which is to help improve patient outcomes by developing better evidence about the products that are on the market that go from pre to post market, better evidence that supports really understanding about the safety, effectiveness of value that can inform patient decision-making, shared decision-making with physicians, payer decision-making, et cetera. And also to promote policies that make sure that we have an environment where innovation is happening, where patients are getting access to the most innovative therapies, and that we are driving towards better value and outcomes. So there's a similar diagram that Rob showed, so it's not overly complicated, but the three major areas that we're working on in biomedical innovation are evidence policy, so policies to support better evidence and to develop better evidence. Regulatory policy for biomedical products, so the science of drug development and the regulatory aspects of that. And then also linking those two pieces to developing better approaches to knowing where the value is, knowing which products are resulting in better value and in which patients, and to have approaches in place that we are incentivizing physicians and patients and payers and medical product developers like the pharmaceutical industry to develop products that are meeting the needs of the patients. So to break this down into the Biomedical Innovation and Evidence Hub, some of the immediate things that we're already working on, we have a large engagement with the FDA to do a lot of important things, as well as other other financial supporters, we're spending a lot of time on this concept of real-world evidence, and you heard that in the earlier work stream. But one of the new things is that traditionally the FDA has not looked at real-world evidence, and many payers and providers and patients are saying, but that's the evidence that shows you how these drugs really work in the real world. And when you have complicated diseases, patients that don't really look like the traditional patients in clinical trials, we need to understand how these products work. So we're working on ways, and this was part of the 21st Century Cures proposal in the House. We're expecting some of this to go into the PDUFA 6 legislation that opens the door for FDA to begin utilizing real-world evidence in its regulatory decision-making. This doesn't mean that a brand new product that's never been on the market will be suddenly approved based on a retrospective database analysis of claims data, because there are lots of different kinds of decisions that the FDA makes, from new molecular entity approvals, but also drugs that are on the market for a certain indication that might actually be beneficial in other patient populations, might actually be beneficial in new uses, and we're looking at ways that the FDA might be able to utilize some of the real-world evidence to support those kinds of decisions. We're also looking at ways to support the Sentinel system, so utilizing real-world evidence to better understand the safety of products. And then future opportunities is actually focused on, a big collaboration with, across Duke, with Adrian at DCRI and others across Duke, to actually pilot new ways of developing evidence that might help medical product evaluation. As well as, we've been talking to some patient groups, patients like me, et cetera, that are looking at how patient-reported outcomes or patient-generated outcomes might actually inform better development of evidence on drugs and devices. We're also working on, in a big area, on linking the utilization of drugs and devices to value. Right now, Gabriella later on will present some work that we're doing in antimicrobial resistance and incentives to develop antibiotics. That's a really challenging market. I won't take all of your slides, but Gabriella. But the gist of it is that it takes a long time. It's really expensive to develop a new drug. But in the area of antibiotics, we can't use it once it's on the market. We need to protect, preserve its utility, limit its use through stewardship, and that really creates a negative incentive for anybody to go into the area of drug development for antibiotics. It's much more lucrative to go into oncology or heart failure, and so we've seen a lot of companies getting out of the space of drug development, and for antibiotics, that's an important issue. Also, many groups, providers, hospital systems are using value frameworks to better understand the value of products when they're thinking about utilizing them. And there are some complications and challenges with perspectives. Are patients well represented in those value frameworks? Are they useful for payers? And so we will be doing a lot of work with Karina and Gabrielle as well, and Jillian on evaluating those frameworks and coming up with maybe better approaches to developing those. And then future opportunities, again, leveraging the Duke expertise and the tremendous opportunities we have here, is to actually do pilot studies to look at, for example, how CMS's Part B reforms are coming out. We're still not exactly sure how those are going to go, but there is a need for payers, medical product developers, patients and providers, and health economists to sit around a table and actually look at what are the most meaningful approaches to reform the way that we pay for drugs, so that we are incentivizing innovation and rewarding for value. So lots of pilot opportunities that we're hoping to engage going forward. And also looking at the different kinds of drugs. Curative drugs that are gene therapies have a unique set of issues with how do you pay for them. They're really high cost up front. It's oftentimes a one-time payment, and those benefits don't accrue until 5-10 years down the road. And that's sort of a challenge for our health insurance system in the way that we underwrite the cost of healthcare and set premium rates, and it creates a challenge to implement some of those new value reforms when the benefits really don't accrue until much further down the road. So looking at those and developing policy approaches to address those is a big area for us going forward. And then finally, regulatory policy. This gets to improving the way that we develop and regulate drugs through the development and approval process. we've been spending a lot of time with FDA, a lot of time with clinical experts in drug development, many of whom are here at Duke, in thinking through how to make sure that we have a system that can get biomarkers out and surrogate endpoints and accelerating drug development. FDA just approached us a couple weeks ago, saying we really want to do a better job with adaptive clinical trials, but there are a lot of statistical challenges. Bayesian techniques and not having a p-value is not really what FDA wants to do in terms of approving a drug. They like to see a p-value. But we need to modernize the way that we're looking at drug development and looking at the evidence. And FDA is certainly interested in saying, how can we actually use Bayesian methodology and improve the way that we do adaptive clinical trials so that we can make more efficient use of time and resources to get drugs on the market. And so they've approached us to help bring statisticians and clinicians and others to the table to think through what better approaches might be. Off-label promotion, the REMS program, which is the risk evaluation, mitigation, and strategy, is an approach that when we are approving a drug on the market, we know that there's some risks, tools to minimize those risks so that patients can actually have access to those important therapies, but engage in activities that might limit their risk and make sure that we're maximizing the benefits and minimizing those risks. That seems like a simple concept, but implementing programs and tools that actually are effective at doing that are actually really challenging to do, and they're often done in ways that aren't well evidence-based. And so we're working with FDA to think through how we can improve the development and use of those tools. And then going forward with medical product development, again, looking at the patient's perspective. The patient-focused drug development program is something that we have in the United States. And the idea is that we should be approving drugs and looking at the evidence through the lens of a patient. Let's make sure that these drugs are actually affecting the outcomes that are most meaningful to patients. Let's make sure that the risks that patients are facing are looked at and accounted for. And the only way to really do that is improve the way that we're engaging with patients through the drug development process and improving the methodology and rigor that we're using to collect preferences and evidence from patients that can inform the benefit-risk calculation. So lots of opportunities there for that as well. So we've asked Jillian Sanders-Schmidler, Emily Zietler, and David Ridley to give real-time examples of ongoing projects that are really supporting a lot of this work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jillian.
Yes.